And then Cunningham gets into the face of DiJonai Carrington. So clearly was a foul, was called.
Men should not play sports against women. I'm not going to get into all the bullshit that's going on out here in the world today. If anybody thinks that, I think they're stupid. I'm not.
August 8, 2026, was supposed to be another night of WNBA basketball. Instead, one collision turned into a controversy that quickly spread far beyond the court. Sophie Cunningham was racing toward the basket when DiJonai Carrington came from behind, and the defensive play ended with Cunningham hitting the floor hard. Officials initially ruled it a flagrant 1, but after reviewing the footage, they upgraded it to a flagrant 2 and ejected Carrington. That alone would have been enough to dominate the headlines. But then something happened after the whistle that changed the entire conversation.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a hard foul. I don't think that DiJonai intentionally came out to get her across the neck like she did, but it did happen, and I thought it was the right call. But, you know, one of the things about Nay is that she's going to play her butt off, man. She's going to compete. Nobody's going to go walking in for a layup. And so I don't oppose the hard foul, but I also don't think that she intentionally went for the net.
Carrington took the controversy to social media with a post that immediately triggered a wave of reactions, while Cunningham offered her own response.
DiJonai Carrington is such an unserious person, because what do you mean you commit a flagrant 2 and then you go to Threads and play the victim?
Now trying to prevent the layup, but that is just a hard hit. That's definitely going to be upgraded, I think, to a flagrant 2, Ryan.
I think that is going to be a flagrant 2. There is wind up, there is follow through, there's potential for injury.
Like, that was such a clear flagrant 2. Like, clearly she almost took Sophie's head off, and I don't even like Sophie, and she got me on this internet defending Sophie, like, but that was a clear flagrant 2. Like, there is no question about it. So the fact that she went to Threads, and anybody called this, like, everybody knew she was about to go to Threads as soon as she got ejected from the game. And then the fact that she tagged the Indiana Fever, what does the Fever got to do with it? The refs are who threw you out the game. It has nothing to do with the Fever. And to say white privilege, like, I'm just so confused. You are the one who fouled her. Like, what is not clicking? And it was 100% done on purpose. And I can only assume it's because of all of Sophie Cunningham's comments that she's been making to the media in the last couple of weeks about biological men and women's sports and all that. And like I said, I don't even like Sophie Cunningham, but girl, that was definitely a flagrant 2. At this point, I just have to assume that DiJonai loves attention and clout, because you clearly wanted attention when you committed that flagrant 2, and you wanted attention when you went to Threads. I mean, this is the same person who outed her relationship drama on Threads, so are we surprised?
And suddenly, this wasn't just about one foul anymore. With Charles Barkley already known for speaking bluntly about the WNBA, Caitlin Clark's name entering the conversation, and another matchup between these teams looming, the real question became, where does competitive basketball end, and something much bigger begin? The game had barely settled into its rhythm when the moment happened. Sophie Cunningham was pushing ahead on a fast break, looking to finish at the rim, and DiJonai Carrington was chasing the play from behind. In a split second, Carrington reached across with her left arm. Instead of making clean contact with the basketball, her arm came across Cunningham's upper body and face area, sending Cunningham down hard. There was no long build-up. No warning that something dramatic was about to happen. 1 second Cunningham was heading toward the basket, and the next she was on the floor while players and officials rushed toward the scene.
Take a walk with me, take a walk with me, take a walk with me. There is craziness going on in the WNBA. DiJonai Carrington tweeted out white privilege from the locker room of a game that she was playing in. Get this, she fouled Sophie Cunningham hard. Sophie Cunningham, obviously a white person, fouled her hard. Flagrant 2, gets ejected, goes to the locker room and tweets out white privilege in the middle of the game. Now here's the kicker to me. A flagrant 2 has to be contact that can lead to an injury that looks excessive. DiJonai, it was about as excessive as possible. If there was any evidence of there being white privilege, this was not it.
That is what made the replay so important. From one angle, the play looked like an aggressive attempt to stop a transition basket. From another, the amount of contact made the foul look much more dangerous. And that distinction became the center of the debate almost immediately. The officials initially assessed the play as a flagrant 1. But after reviewing the footage, they changed the ruling to a flagrant 2. That decision meant Carrington was ejected, and suddenly a physical basketball play had become one of the biggest talking points surrounding the game. For Indiana Fever fans, the reaction was immediate. Cunningham had already become a recognizable figure around the team, and her arrival in Indiana had added another layer of personality to a roster already receiving enormous attention because of Caitlin Clark. Cunningham isn't simply viewed through the lens of her statistics. She has developed a reputation for being outspoken, emotional, and willing to engage with the culture surrounding the league. That is part of why this particular incident exploded so quickly. Cunningham got back to her feet and moved toward Carrington. The exchange didn't turn into a full fight, but the tension was obvious. Teammates and staff stepped between the players before the situation could escalate any further. And then Carrington headed toward the locker room. At that point, the basketball decision had already been made. She was ejected. The officials had reviewed the footage. The game was continuing. But the conversation outside the arena was just beginning. Because within minutes, Carrington posted the words, "white privilege," on social media and tagged the Indiana Fever. That changed the nature of the story. Instead of fans debating only whether the foul deserved a flagrant 1 or a flagrant 2, people were now debating what Carrington meant by the post, why she made it, and whether the incident had anything to do with race. Those are very different questions. The foul itself can be evaluated through basketball rules. Intent can be debated by watching the replay. But determining what someone meant by a social media post requires more context. That distinction is important because the internet has a way of turning one moment into an entire narrative before everyone involved has even left the building. Some viewers immediately interpreted the post as a response to the criticism Carrington was receiving. Others viewed it as an accusation directed at the Fever and the people defending Cunningham. Still others argued that the social media message had nothing to do with the actual basketball play and only intensified an already heated situation. Meanwhile, Cunningham had her own perspective. After the game, she indicated that she didn't believe there was an existing personal feud between herself and Carrington. That detail matters because it raises another question. If there wasn't a known personal rivalry between the two players, why did the incident become so emotionally charged? Was the social media exchange simply frustration spilling over after a physical game? Was it connected to the larger arguments surrounding Cunningham's public comments? Or was everyone watching the situation through the lens of conflicts that had already been building around the WNBA? Those questions are exactly what made this story bigger than one possession. And then there was another layer. Caitlin Clark. Anyone who has followed the WNBA closely knows that physical incidents involving Clark can become enormous stories almost instantly. Clark's popularity has brought millions of new viewers into women's basketball, but it has also created an unusually intense environment around games involving the Indiana Fever. Every hard foul is analyzed. Every confrontation is replayed. Every social media post is dissected. And that means Cunningham, as one of Clark's teammates, can become part of that larger conversation even when Clark isn't directly involved in the play. Carrington also had history with Clark. In 2024, during a game involving the Fever, Carrington made contact with Clark around the eye while defending her. The incident became a major online discussion, with fans disagreeing over whether the contact was accidental, reckless, or simply part of normal physical basketball. Carrington said afterward that she was trying to make a play on the ball and did not intentionally try to hit Clark. That previous moment became relevant again after the Cunningham incident because fans naturally began comparing the two plays. But comparison isn't proof of intent. That is where the debate becomes complicated. A player can have a history of aggressive defense without every future foul being intentional. At the same time, fans are allowed to question whether repeated controversial moments should lead the league to examine how physical play is being handled. And that brings us back to the flagrant 2 decision. A flagrant 2 doesn't automatically prove that a player intended to injure another player. The official's decision is based on the nature and severity of the contact and the circumstances surrounding the play. That's an important distinction that often disappears once a controversial moment starts trending. The internet wants a simple answer. Was Carrington the villain? Was Cunningham the victim? Was the foul intentional? Was it racial? Was it just basketball? Real situations are often more complicated than those 4 choices. And this is where Charles Barkley's perspective becomes particularly interesting. Barkley has never been known for carefully avoiding controversial sports opinions. When he believes a league, player, coach, or television network is getting something wrong, he has generally been willing to say it directly. His broader comments about women's basketball, physical play, Caitlin Clark, and the debate surrounding women's sports have already made him a familiar voice in these conversations. But Barkley's philosophy on physical basketball is also important. He has consistently recognized that basketball is a contact sport. Defenders are supposed to compete. Players are going to collide. Hard fouls happen. A physical game isn't automatically a dirty game. The question is where the line is. When a defender is trying to stop a breakaway, there is a legitimate basketball reason to challenge the shot. But once the contact becomes excessive or creates a serious risk of injury, officials have to decide whether the play crossed that line. In Cunningham's case, they ultimately decided it did. That doesn't settle the argument about Carrington's intentions. It does, however, establish what the officials believed after reviewing the footage. And then the social media post added an entirely different dimension. Because now the story wasn't just about a foul. It was about race. It was about the Indiana Fever. It was about Sophie Cunningham. It was about Caitlin Clark's enormous fan base. It was about previous incidents. And eventually, it became about the culture surrounding the WNBA itself. That's why this moment became so explosive. One play created the controversy. The ejection gave it a headline. The social media post gave it a second storyline. And the history surrounding the players gave the internet a reason to dig even deeper. But there was still one thing nobody could completely agree on. Did the foul represent an overly aggressive basketball play that simply went too far, or was there something more behind the tension between these teams? And that question became even more important when the next chapter of this rivalry came into view. Because the Fever and Sky weren't finished with each other. They were scheduled to meet again. And after everything that happened on August 8th, the next matchup suddenly carried an entirely different level of attention. The biggest mistake would be to assume that everyone watching the incident saw the same thing. They didn't. Some fans watched the replay and immediately saw a dangerous foul that deserved the flagrant 2 ruling. Others looked at the same footage and believed Carrington was simply trying to stop a fast break layup and that the contact became worse because of the speed of the play. That disagreement is normal in sports. What wasn't normal was how quickly the conversation moved away from the basketball court. Once Carrington's white privilege post began circulating, the incident became part of a much larger argument about race, fandom, and the way Indiana Fever games are discussed online. And this is where the story became especially complicated. Cunningham has been outspoken about women's sports and has publicly expressed views that have attracted both support and criticism. Because of those positions, some people already viewed her through a political lens before she ever stepped onto the court. That meant the foul wasn't being watched in a vacuum. For supporters of Cunningham, the social media post looked like an unnecessary escalation after a play that had already been reviewed and punished by the officials. For Carrington supporters, however, the situation was being viewed through a completely different lens. They argued that Cunningham and the Fever fan base have received enormous attention and that conversations around the team often become racialized online. Those competing interpretations collided almost instantly. And once that happens on social media, nuance usually disappears. A 15-second clip can become a political argument. A single sentence can become a headline. A player's emotional reaction can become evidence for an entire theory about the league. That's exactly what happened here. The situation also highlighted one of the most unusual realities of the modern WNBA. There is no ordinary level of attention around the Indiana Fever. Every Fever game can become a national conversation because of Caitlin Clark. Her popularity has brought in fans who may not have followed women's basketball before, and those fans don't always agree with the established culture around the league. Some are longtime WNBA supporters. Some are Clark First fans. Some follow the league because of the growing competition. Others are interested primarily because the WNBA has become part of a much larger cultural debate. Those groups often interpret the same event completely differently. That's why the Cunningham-Carrington incident spread so quickly. And it wasn't only the players who became part of the discussion. Charles Barkley was already a major voice in the conversation. Barkley has spent years building a reputation for saying what he thinks, even when the subject is uncomfortable. His approach is different from the carefully worded statements audiences often hear from professional leagues. He doesn't usually speak like a press release. He speaks like a former player. And that matters. When Barkley discusses women's basketball, he often separates two things that people online frequently combine: competitive physicality and dangerous contact. He has no problem with players competing hard. He has no problem with defense. He has no problem with intensity. But there is a point where physical basketball can become reckless. That's the issue at the center of the Cunningham incident. The question isn't whether Carrington was allowed to defend Cunningham. Of course she was. The question is whether the manner of that defensive attempt created excessive contact. The officials answered that question with a flagrant 2 ruling. But the public debate continued because people weren't only arguing about the call anymore. They were arguing about motivation. And motivation is much harder to prove. You can replay a foul from 10 different angles, but you can't replay what's inside a player's head. That's why some of the strongest claims surrounding the incident should be treated carefully. Saying the foul looked excessive is one thing. Saying it was definitely intentional is another. Saying Carrington's social media post was provocative is one thing. Saying it proves the foul was politically motivated is another. Those are conclusions that require evidence. And this distinction becomes especially important when Caitlin Clark enters the conversation. Clark's presence has changed the economics and visibility of the WNBA. Games involving the Fever routinely attract enormous attention, and that attention means every controversial moment receives additional scrutiny. Carrington's previous confrontation with Clark became part of that history. In 2024, a defensive play involving Carrington and Clark produced one of the most widely circulated clips of that season. Carrington later explained that she was attempting to make a play on the ball and did not intend to strike Clark in the eye. That explanation didn't satisfy everyone. Some fans believed the incident was accidental. Others believed it deserved greater punishment. But regardless of where someone stood, the moment became part of the relationship between Carrington and the enormous audience surrounding Clark. So when Carrington was involved in another controversial physical play involving an Indiana player 2 years later, fans immediately remembered the earlier incident. That is how sports memory works. One controversial moment becomes context for the next. And sometimes that context is fair. Sometimes it isn't. But it absolutely affects the way people watch the game. The same thing happens in the NBA, NFL, MLB, and college sports. Once a player becomes associated with controversy, every future incident involving that player gets examined more intensely. Carrington was no longer being judged only on August 8th. She was being judged through the memories of previous moments. And Cunningham was dealing with something similar. Her public statements meant that some viewers were already predisposed to interpret the incident as political. That doesn't establish why the foul happened. It simply explains why the reaction became so intense. This is where the WNBA faces a difficult challenge. The league wants physical, competitive basketball. It also has to protect players from dangerous contact. At the same time, the league operates in a social media environment where every controversial call can become a culture war argument within minutes. Officials can make one decision. Players can make one post. Fans can create thousands of interpretations. And suddenly the league is dealing with a story much larger than the original play. That's exactly what happened here. The flagrant 2 decision could have been the end of the story. Carrington was ejected. The officials had reviewed the play. The Fever continued playing. But the social media reaction reopened everything. Now the audience wanted to know whether the post was connected to Cunningham's political views. They wanted to know whether Carrington had a personal issue with Cunningham. They wanted to know whether the Fever were being treated differently. And they wanted to know what Charles Barkley thought. Barkley's previous comments about Caitlin Clark became relevant because he has repeatedly recognized the unusual amount of attention surrounding her. He has also criticized people who seem to resent the popularity of women's basketball's biggest stars. That doesn't automatically mean Barkley believes every controversial incident involving the Fever is intentional. In fact, his broader philosophy suggests something more balanced. Basketball is supposed to be competitive. Players are supposed to challenge shots. Defenders are supposed to make opponents uncomfortable. But the league still has to draw a line when contact becomes excessive. That's the balance. And that balance is becoming more important as the WNBA audience expands. The league isn't being watched by one unified audience anymore. It's being watched by people with completely different expectations. Some want pure basketball. Some want personalities. Some want rivalries. Some want cultural debates. And some want all of it at the same time. That creates an environment where a single foul can become a national story. The Cunningham incident demonstrated that perfectly. Within minutes, the conversation had moved from a basketball possession to race. Then it moved toward Caitlin Clark. Then it moved toward women's sports. Then it moved toward the culture surrounding the WNBA. And the longer the debate continued, the harder it became to separate what actually happened from what people believed happened. But there was one fact nobody could dispute. The officials watched the replay and decided the contact was serious enough to warrant a flagrant 2. That decision gave the critics of the play something concrete to point to. At the same time, Carrington supporters could still argue that the contact wasn't intentional. Both things can exist simultaneously. A player doesn't have to intend an injury for a foul to be dangerous. And a dangerous foul doesn't automatically prove malicious intent. That distinction is often lost online. The bigger problem is what happens afterward. When players take controversial moments to social media, the story doesn't end. It multiplies. Every post creates another reaction. Every reaction creates another headline. And every headline creates another argument. That is why the August 8th incident became much bigger than Cunningham falling to the floor. It became another test of how the WNBA handles physical play, player rivalries, social media, and an audience that is becoming increasingly passionate. And then there was the rematch. The next meeting between these teams was already on the calendar. Now fans weren't simply going to watch a basketball game. They were going to watch Carrington. They were going to watch Cunningham. They were going to watch how the Fever responded. And most importantly, they were going to watch whether the tension from August 8th carried on to the court. Because once a controversial moment becomes part of a rivalry, the next game can become the real test. And that's exactly where this story was heading. By the time the dust began to settle, the biggest question wasn't whether DiJonai Carrington had been ejected. That part was already settled. The officials reviewed the play, upgraded the foul, and sent her to the locker room. The bigger question was what happened next. Because in modern sports, the final whistle doesn't necessarily end the story anymore. Sometimes, the real story begins when the players pick up their phones. Carrington's social media post had transformed a physical basketball incident into a much broader argument, and now everyone involved was being pulled into the conversation. Sophie Cunningham had become the center of one side of the debate. Carrington had become the center of the other. Caitlin Clark's name was being brought into the discussion because of the Fever connection and the history surrounding Carrington. And then there was Charles Barkley. Barkley represents something unusual in today's sports media environment. He is a former superstar who isn't afraid to criticize the leagues he covers, and he doesn't normally hide behind complicated language. His opinions about the WNBA have often focused on the same basic principle: women's basketball deserves respect, but that doesn't mean every controversial decision should be ignored simply because the sport is growing. That's important here. The WNBA has spent years trying to establish itself as a serious professional league with elite athletes, competitive games, and physical defense. That means the league can't have one standard for ordinary contact and another standard when a moment becomes controversial online. Players need to be allowed to compete. But they also need to know where the line is. And officials need to enforce that line consistently. That's where incidents like this become important. The question isn't whether Carrington should be allowed to play aggressively. She absolutely should. The question is whether the league's disciplinary system creates a clear enough standard for dangerous contact. If the answer is yes, then the flagrant 2 ruling should be viewed as the system working. If the answer is no, then the league needs to explain what the standard actually is. Fans shouldn't have to guess. Players shouldn't have to guess. And coaches shouldn't have to guess. One of the reasons the incident became so controversial is because everyone brought their own history into it. Fever fans remembered previous incidents involving Caitlin Clark. Carrington supporters remembered the criticism that she has received. Cunningham supporters remembered her comments about women's sports. And neutral basketball viewers were left trying to figure out what was actually happening on the court. That's an important distinction. A basketball game should not require viewers to choose a political side before they can decide whether a foul was excessive. The replay should be enough to start the discussion. Everything else should come afterward. But social media doesn't work that way. Social media rewards the strongest reaction. A calm explanation rarely travels as far as an angry accusation. A nuanced statement rarely gets as much attention as 3 provocative words. And that's why the white privilege post became such a major part of the story. Whether someone agreed with it or disagreed with it, the post gave the controversy a second life. Suddenly, people who hadn't even watched the game were talking about the incident. That is the power and danger of social media for professional athletes. One post can reach millions of people. It can shape the public narrative before interviews are conducted. It can turn a basketball decision into a cultural argument. And once that happens, walking the story back becomes almost impossible. That's also why players have to understand that their social media decisions can become part of the game itself. A player can leave the court after an ejection and the basketball portion of the incident may be over. But if that player posts something provocative afterward, the story continues. That's not necessarily a criticism of Carrington specifically. It's simply the reality of professional sports in 2026. And the Fever are at the center of that reality more than almost any other WNBA team. Caitlin Clark has changed the level of attention surrounding the franchise. Every opponent knows that a Fever game can attract a massive audience. Every controversial play can become a viral clip. Every physical confrontation can be replayed thousands of times. That doesn't mean opponents are intentionally targeting Fever players. It does mean that their games are being watched more closely. And when you are watched more closely, mistakes receive more attention too. That's why the August 23rd matchup matters. The rematch will not happen in the same emotional vacuum as the original game. Fans will remember what happened. Players will remember what happened. The media will remember what happened. And even if everyone publicly moves on, the history will still be there. The most interesting thing will be whether the players actually let it affect the basketball. Will Carrington defend Cunningham differently? Will Cunningham respond physically? Will teammates become more protective? Will officials watch the matchup more closely? Or will both teams simply play basketball and leave the previous controversy behind? Nobody can know that in advance. And that's exactly why the rematch became such an effective storyline. There is another reason this matters. The WNBA is still building its relationship with a rapidly expanding audience. New fans are watching because of Caitlin Clark. Others are watching because they have followed women's basketball for years. Some fans are drawn to the competition. Others are drawn to the personalities. And some are interested in the arguments surrounding the league. That mixture can create enormous attention, but it can also create enormous tension. The league has to find a way to let players be outspoken without allowing every disagreement to become a permanent feud. It has to protect players without eliminating the physical edge that makes professional basketball exciting. And it has to make disciplinary decisions that fans can understand. That's not easy. But incidents like the Cunningham-Carrington confrontation forced the league to confront those questions publicly. And Charles Barkley's role in all of this is interesting because he has consistently argued that women's basketball deserves the same level of honest criticism as every other professional sport. If something is good, say it's good. If something is bad, say it's bad. If a player makes a mistake, analyze the mistake. If an official makes a questionable call, discuss the call. And if a league has a problem, address the problem. That straightforward approach is part of why Barkley remains such a powerful voice. But there's another side to this conversation that shouldn't be ignored. Not every hard foul is evidence of a conspiracy. Not every disagreement is racial. Not every physical mistake is intentional. And not every controversial post proves that the original basketball play was planned. Those distinctions matter if the goal is to understand what actually happened. It's possible to believe that the foul deserved a flagrant 2 while also believing there was no proven intent to injure Cunningham. It's possible to criticize Carrington's social media post without claiming to know exactly what she meant. It's possible to support Cunningham without turning every opposing player into an enemy. And it's possible to support Carrington while still acknowledging that the play had dangerous consequences. That's the kind of conversation the WNBA needs. Because the league doesn't benefit when fans stop talking about basketball and start fighting each other. The players don't benefit from it either. And neither do the fans who simply want to watch elite athletes compete. But controversy isn't always bad for a league. In some ways, it shows just how much attention the WNBA is receiving. The real challenge is what the league does with that attention. Does it create clearer standards? Does it encourage players to handle disagreements responsibly? Does it protect athletes while preserving physical competition? And can the league keep its biggest rivalries from becoming personal? Those questions will remain long after the clips disappear from social media. And now the August 23rd matchup gives everyone another reason to watch. Maybe nothing happens. Maybe the players shake hands, play hard, and move forward. Maybe the previous controversy becomes nothing more than another chapter in a long season. Or maybe the tension returns the moment Cunningham and Carrington share the floor again. That's the part nobody can predict. What we do know is that one defensive play turned into a flagrant 2 ejection, a social media controversy, a renewed debate about Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever, and another reminder that the WNBA is operating under an unprecedented level of public attention. And Charles Barkley knows better than most that once sports become this big, every decision gets examined. The foul gets examined. The reaction gets examined. The players get examined. And even the silence afterward gets examined. So the next game won't just be another game. For many fans, it will be a test of whether August 8th was simply one ugly moment in a competitive season, or the beginning of a rivalry that refuses to disappear. And that's why everyone will be watching when these teams meet again. So now the question is bigger than one foul, one ejection, or one social media post. Was DiJonai Carrington's contact with Sophie Cunningham simply an overly aggressive attempt to stop a fast break layup, or did the aftermath reveal deeper tension between the players, the Fever, and their critics? And what do you make of Charles Barkley's perspective on the way the WNBA handles physical play and controversy? One thing is certain, this story isn't disappearing anytime soon, especially with another meeting between these teams on the calendar. The next matchup could tell us whether August 8th was just an isolated incident or the beginning of something much bigger. I want to hear your take. Was the flagrant 2 call correct? Did the social media post make the situation worse? And should the league take additional action, or was the ejection enough? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next major WNBA story. Because when the Fever are involved, the conversation is never just about basketball.